From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hello and welcome to the UK Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Peter Kelly and I'm obviously with Hayley Farrell. How are you going, Hayley?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Pete. I'm looking forward to Bank Holiday weekend. How are you?
Oh, I'm looking forward to Bank Holiday weekend, but in Preston we have this famous event called egg rolling, and you roll your chocolates down a hill from the top, and when it gets really rainy, you can roll your kids down the hill. So depending on the weather, we'll have to see how it goes. Wouldn't recommend rolling the children down the hill, but it has happened in the past, so it's things you do on Easter Monday, isn't it? So the problem is, if you've got a dog, you can't.
I mean, I think the adults should get involved.
Sorry?
The adults should roll down the muddy hill too. I mean,
yeah,
what better way to look after your well-being than getting in nature and have some fun?
Some of them do when the event's over. Look, I'm just putting, if they, it's quite fun to watch. Adults rolling down hills, taking us back to when we were children. Anyway, as usual, random conversation between Hayley and Peter. Hayley, who have we got today? Who is on the podcast?
I'm delighted that we have got a guest with us who I've been trying to get with us for a couple of weeks. But it's amazing that he is here with us today, and we're going to have a really rich discussion, and he brings such an important lens to psychological health and safety. So I'm really happy to introduce Lee Chambers, who's joining us, and I'm going to hand straight over to Lee to introduce yourself.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be with you today. So I'm Lee Chambers, founder of Essentialise, an inclusive workplace wellbeing agency based in Preston. Background as a psychologist, also run a tech business. Been through my own health challenges, both physical and mental, over the years. I'm autistic, and that gives me, again, a different lens on some of the work that I do. But most importantly, I'm very, very passionate about wellbeing opportunity. I'm very passionate about wellbeing being intersectional, and more than ever, kind of do a lot of work looking at health inequalities, how they play out in the workplace, and how we can create a universal opportunity of wellbeing for work to be a net promoter of positivity for everyone in a workplace, rather than sometimes it just being the select few.
Amazingly, you bring such a wealth of lived experience, I think, but also the lens and the intersectionality with neurodiversity. So amazing. Let's jump straight into it, Pete.
Lee, before I ask the very important question I'm going to ask, are you coming egg rolling on Monday if you're based in Preston?
Egg rolling, I'm there. Just let me know location, time. I'll be there. I'll be rolling some eggs.
Avenham Park, 11:30. Next to the Easter bonnet. I'll see you there. All right, then. Bring your chocolate egg.
My office is 5 minutes away from Evernham Park.
Oh, Lee, I didn't know that. We could have had coffee. We could have gone to the many great pubs there in Preston. But talking about what's good for your well-being, what is the well-being landscape in the UK at the present? What do you think the well-being landscape in the UK is at present?
It's really interesting, Peter. We've obviously got an increased awareness, and that has been building. It's been amplified in some ways by the pandemic, but we were on an upward trajectory of awareness probably since about 2015 from my perspective. And as we've kind of seen, a lot of work around the physical aspects, around accidents at work, around health and safety from a kind of a physical and physiological perspective really advance in terms of reducing the issues and the challenges and the risks. We've kind of seen the awareness around, well-being, especially from a mental perspective, really increase. The landscape today, well, I suppose it's interesting. Within workplaces, there is increasing awareness. There is an increase in action, but sometimes not always maybe as effective as it might want to be. If we look at some of the financial impacts and stresses that are impacting individuals and communities at the minute, they are amplifying some significant challenges. The pandemic hit certain groups of lesser privilege a lot more than it did others. And we kind of are still in a place where some of the psychological distress that people went through they suppressed elements of that as there was so many other people going through something worse. And I think this year, so for some people, they've had a chance to breathe. And actually, that psychological distress has come to the fore, and some people are really struggling at the minute. So we're seeing, numerous different things. It's interesting that we are talking more about this. Some of the innovative work in the space has the potential to make a real difference. But it feels like a pivotal time for wellbeing, especially in the workplace at the moment. And that's why I'm so passionate about making sure our advancements are also inclusive and accessible for the majority. So yeah, that kind of drives my passion for this work.
And that's right on the point.
Absolutely.
With EDL and everything else. I mean, it's fascinating for me as a dyslexic and dyspraxic practitioner to live through this world that we're currently in at the moment, and at the same time to be aware that my own personal well-being and the well-being of the businesses and organisations we work at has to be forefront. And the pandemic, did it not show up the fracture lines in how we did work and how work was organised? What do you think, Hayley?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm keen to drill into Lee's thoughts, though, about some of the innovative work that's happening in the space that has the real opportunity to make a difference, as you said. Would you be happy to kind of highlight one or two of those two key innovative pieces of work that you see happening that could really make a step change?
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting things I've seen is where companies and individuals are actually bringing inclusion and wellbeing together and fusing those two as a parallel pathway rather than working with them in isolation. And what that's doing is they're able to see how reciprocal wellbeing and inclusion are as concepts, and actually how they can continue to advance both at an increased rate by bringing them together and kind of looking how they can amplify each other. Some of the other interesting kind of stuff I've seen around how we use virtual reality to generate empathy that can then be used as a platform for changing behaviours towards being more inclusive, or give people compelling appreciation for what it's like to live with wellbeing challenges. That then makes them more compassionate towards those who are going through those challenges, and I suppose an amplified awareness of other people's lived experience, which is something that is, even when we try and do that through story, it can be inspiring, but it's very, very different to have an experience where you are physically in someone else's mind, looking out through someone else's eyes, literally navigating the workplace in someone else's shoes. So those are two things that, we're kind of party to, but it's great to see, a lot more starting to look at the risks, really kind of digging in to those underlying factors, because a lot of work has been, at the very top end, trying to come up with solutions and interventions that can, that can really attack something that's been noticed. But actually, it's those foundational aspects of really kind of analysing those underlying risks, and companies are getting a bit more comfortable with data at both quantitative and qualitative, and being able to use that to drive evidence-based decision making and really be able to target what they're doing. And that's a process that a lot of companies are starting to go through. But what's so important is it just doesn't fall to HR to be their responsibility solely, and it's just you who has to do that. So it's a very much an organisation is an ecosystem, and it requires various stakeholders across that ecosystem to be part and parcel of actually driving these things forward.
So much to explore there. Virtual reality and the ability, I think, to help support the unconscious bias as well that we're trying to help people to overcome, which is a challenge, but also can bring up a lot of emotion for people. But you have alluded to, the root cause and identifying the risk. So what is your interpretation of a risk and a needs-based approach to well-being?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, it comes down to the fact that we have within an organisation like individual risks and more kind of community or demographic risks, and it's very much kind of looking at and taking that step back and actually looking at what people are directly facing. And, a lot of well-being, again, is very much on the what can we do? Quite a lot of it is on the what can we add? And actually, the risk-based, needs-based approach is actually looking and really analysing, sometimes what can we actually remove and take away? What barriers and obstacles? What potential risks, both, present and future? And really starting to look at what are the underlying factors causing the challenges that we have. And, it's easy to kind of look at, say, numerous employees and senior leadership team are reporting, burnout. And it's very easy to look and think, right, we need burnout awareness, we need training on burnout, we need to kind of look at how we can bring in some support for them in that position. When actually, have you kind of taken a step back and looked at the workloads? Are they realistic? Are roles clear? Do people have opportunities to express the challenges that they're facing? It's really important that we kind of look and take that step back and really kind of go upstream. Because at the minute, we're kind of pulling people out as they're almost about to fall off the waterfall. And actually, why did they fall off the bridge into the water in the first place?
Yeah.
Desmond Tutu stated that, didn't he?
Yeah, he did.
Where are they in the river? Go up the river and find them rather than wait until they're gone.
Yeah, and we can identify that by looking at what we have in terms of data. Quite often, it's data from sometimes other processes, from working patterns. We can look at what KPIs we're currently measuring and see. We can see where some of the challenges are. It's almost like following the trail. We kind of ask people to become a bit like Sherlock Holmes. Become a detective, become a wellbeing detective, and go and have a look about why is this here? Well, actually, follow the clues, and what you might have to speak to some of your team, because they're a great source of qualitative evidence and clue gathering, because they're on the floor delivering things, they see things, they appreciate things. But you can start to join the dots up and get to a point where you're actually like, if we mitigate this, it's going to benefit this whole chain of events. And actually, it doesn't cost the world to do that either.
Lee, what do you think?
The most powerful thing about what you've said, though, is don't add more. Don't add more to fix a problem. Go look at the root cause of the problem and reduce that first. It speaks volumes for me in the space.
Yeah, we should all be editors. We should be editing things out. We should be looking for efficiencies. We should be able to, boil it down to a point where it becomes less complex. And that, again, we want to try and promote that a straightforwardness almost, to try and get it to a point where we're not, continually additive, but actually we see where we can be reductive.
It's about being real in this space, isn't it? Being real in our conversations and our engagement with people. But in saying that, what do you think the skill sets that are required to be a well-being leader, and where are they? And do you see any gaps at the moment? I'd be interested to understand your opinion.
Yeah, so, when you work in this space, you end up in a privileged position to meet lots of interesting people who work solely on well-being or solely on inclusion, or people who are within HR who've been tasked with that as a specialism. You get to meet people who'd like to move into that field, and you're able to see what they're interested in. And the big thing for me is, if you are tasked as say a wellbeing officer within an organisation, it's still a relatively young role in terms of, what's been set out, what the expectations are. And sometimes that means that because it's less defined, your role becomes what the organisation wants you to be. And that can be a real challenge, because that might have or conflict against what you want to be able to achieve. But the big things within that role are a good core knowledge of wellbeing as a concept. And, that gives you an appreciation for, what ultimately the core skill set of your role is, and that understanding. And a lot of people do move into it with, a feeling of lived experience, of having gone through it, and some knowledge around it because they've become passionate about it and started to research and dig a bit deeper. What I kind of see though is to actually be an effective wellbeing officer, you need to work within a system and start to change systems and structures. And that requires really strong communication skills, both in terms of how you create engagement for what you're doing, but also the ability to communicate and build relationships with key stakeholders who are likely responsible for your budgets and likely to be the leaders who you need to get the buy-in for, so they'll role model the very things that you're looking to deliver and get behind your gradual process of building wider, longer-term strategies and plans. There's also the aspects of systems thinking, because you're in not just a health role, but you're in a change and transformation role. You're actually having to change systems and structures within your organisation. So it actually requires a level of systems thinking, which quite often for people can be and feel a little bit uncomfortable and outside of their core skill set. But ultimately, an organisation is an ecosystem that has a range of different people and groups in, and you've got to find a way to take well-being, which is universal, and implant it and embed it within that ecosystem, which has conflicting priorities, which has a number of different angles. And for that core skill set, yes, passion for well-being, knowledge of well-being is vital. It's very difficult to deliver anything if you've not got a strong self-concept in what it is. But you also need some of that analytical ability, that systems thinking, and you need the comms and the relationship building as well. And they're three quite distinct skill sets to have. And anyone who has all three of those skill sets is an incredibly valuable asset. So for anyone who's kind of moving into that space, you need to look, are you developed in those three areas enough to be able to actually come in and create the systemic change that you want to make? Because no one takes a role on to be ineffective, but it does require quite a wide skill set. And if you haven't got those skills, you need to recruit people with those to go on the journey with you. Because again, might get the resource for that role, but it's not just you. You need to get everyone in the whole organisation on board. Wellbeing is a whole organisational journey. It's not just that you're the officer, you're responsible, you do it to everyone, because it never worked like that.
The edge of your seat. I know you want to ask something. I can tell. Go on. I've been there.
Oh, just the moment of pause and reflection on what Lee has just said there around this broad skill set that's required, but also you spoke a bit earlier about the success that traditional safety has had in this space, and helping people understand that well-being is not only about how somebody feels, it's about the system in which they operate in, and drawing that link back into safety. It is becoming increasingly difficult, I think, in the language that we use around the word well-being, to draw that correlation and to bring people on the journey of understanding that it is change, it's transformation, it's system-based. It's not just about how people feel, making sure they belong, and that they are psychologically safe at work. You can create that environment for them to feel like they can share, but are you actually changing the things that are having an impact, and that is system-driven, a negative impact, should I say. So it just resonates so strongly with me about the challenges of maturing the conversation around the word well-being, what a well-being role looks like, and where we actually need to get it to make systemic change.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with FlourishDX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Lee, I'd love to explore psychosocial hazards of exclusion and the impact on well-being. So obviously the opposite of, we want to get to a place of inclusion. But if we're excluding people, what are those hazards and the impact on well-being?
Yeah, so when we kind of look at this topic, and it's something I'm massively passionate about, and I try to kind of frame it for people in quite a simple way when trying to describe it, especially at first. It's a simple reality that if you kind of look at the wider body of research on both of these topics and the few times where the research has it intersected, what you see is if in an organisation people report being well, the higher they report, the more inclusive their behaviours become of others. Reciprocally, if people feel included and feel like they belong, they report higher levels of well-being. So what you get is this lovely cyclical effect of people becoming more well, including other people who then feel more well, who then include more people. And you get this kind of reciprocity of them continuing. And we've kind of looked and started to appreciate just how powerful belonging is as a well-being factor. And obviously the risk perspective, if we kind of look at the opposite of that, well, when people are excluded, it puts them at risk of wider social isolation, which we all know how social isolation and loneliness impact well-being. They look at it from a public health perspective and say it's as dangerous as, consuming too many units of alcohol, as smoking, as being massively sedentary. It has a massive impact on overall health outcomes. But it's the other knock-on impacts as well. It can impact self-esteem. People are excluded often then are looking and thinking about how they try to get themselves in to those conversations. And it starts to make you feel like it, as human beings, we're comparator individuals. We kind of look at situations and make comparisons. We look for inconsistencies. It's what kept us alive on a planet where, we're never going to survive. We were always prey. These aren't great talons. We were never predators. So we notice inconsistencies. The problem is when you're excluded, the first thing you're going to ask yourself in your internal monologue is why? And why me? And it makes you feel quite often like you're not valued or appreciated. It can feel a bit dehumanizing. And that impacts on your self-concepts and what you feel about yourself. Because over human, it feels like they've taken an active decision to exclude you. And that means that, you're not part of the group. You're not part of the people. You're on the outside. It adds additional stress. And especially for, again, people of lesser privilege, it adds to that minority stress, that overall allostatic load of stress that we have that can get to a point where it becomes chronic and, then has a detrimental impact on our health. But the big thing, like I was saying about belonging being a really important well-being factor, if you're excluded, it decreases that belonging and then removes that from being something that can push your well-being forward. And then there's that wider ecosystem in how workplaces work. Because if you're excluded, you become less trusting. It kind of knocks your bank of trust in others. And we all know how important trust is in the employee experience. And when you don't trust, you're less likely to collaborate. You're less likely to, come together and work in teams because you already feel like, you're not as valuable, but you start to become a little bit less trusting of others. And that means you're less likely to engage. And that in itself can cause sometimes one of two things: for people to become hyper engaged in the work and become, at increased risk of burnout, or to become disengaged from the work and start to lose that motivation and satisfaction that comes with doing a good job, and people start to drift. And it impacts on a similar way on your own social hobbies. People become less attracted to achieving those. So ultimately, it creates a whole set of risks that put people at risk of poor well-being from a number of different angles. And because this already impacts people often who are of lesser privilege, who sit in demographics, whether it be due to race or gender, disability or sexuality, socioeconomic or cultural, they're already at risk of amplified microaggressions, lower levels of opportunity. They're already at risk of more likely to be having challenges in wider society. So it just adds to that burden. And that, again, makes us think about how that then plays out when people try and be well. In fact, it heightens health inequalities, and that decreases health outcomes for people who are excluded. And it's just a sad reality that it's that way. But we have an ability in the workplace to hit people at a more universal level and really make a difference.
Lee, what do you see as the role of communication has in wellbeing and psych health and safety management? We're all about getting the right messages out, but what is the role that communication should be playing in wellbeing and psych health and safety management?
Well, it's massive, Peter. Like I was kind of going back to those skill sets and that ability to communicate effectively internally and externally, and that relationship building. Communication itself, it's the core aspect of awareness and education. Like, to be able to kind of expand awareness and to be able to create effective education around these concepts and topics, we need to be able to communicate effectively. And I mean, it's the old kind of joke in wellbeing that people are not engaging. How did you tell them about these particular things that we're looking to do? Oh, we put it out on the internal intranet. What percentage of staff have access to that internal intranet? Goes and speaks to IT. 37% of people have access to that. What about the other 63%? How did you let them know? We didn't. So it's like communication plays such a vital role, and the awareness and education piece is important, but communication also plays a role in early intervention, because if we're able to actually have those communication channels and able to kind of notice those early signals for people who are struggling, both in terms of a wider ecosystem thing of noticing when people's behaviours change slightly and being curious and kind of seeing what people's needs might be when we notice that. We work with people very closely. We get to know their nuances. We get to know how they are. We can pick up on those things quite often before people pick up on them themselves. But also the communication piece about those, safer and protected spaces, especially again for those who are, overall find it more harder to achieve psychological safety within an organisation's culture, quite often due to previous discrimination and a lack of trust. Creating those spaces and communication is vital to be able to get, their inclusive viewpoints of wellbeing and what actually needs to happen, because they're a great source of information in making wellbeing more inclusive. And the other aspects of communication are, wellbeing doesn't just stand still. It's continuing to evolve. Your strategy needs to continue to monitor and track and, amplify what's working, and start to, look at how you resolve things that simply aren't having an impact. And the communication plays a massive part in that feedback and improvement cycle of wellbeing initiatives, of wellbeing strategies within a workplace. And again, the communication is what gives the ability to see and start to understand, because data is powerful, but you need to wrap a story around that data to compel people. Some people in the organisation just want burst statistics, and they'll love that. Give them a spreadsheet and they'll be, yeah, I'm happy with this. But some people want a nice infographic. Some people want you to tell them a story. And it's about thinking how we bring people, those key stakeholders. They have different metrics they're being measured by. They have different outcomes they might want. How do we use communication? The final thing around that is, collaboration is vital in wellbeing. It can't just be one person. It can't just be one function. We have to bring people on that journey with us. And that is a communication piece. How do we get and garner support? How do we garner resource? how do we actually create resources for people and help them to be moved towards support when they might need it? Because sometimes communication is powerful, all those external aspects, but the one big thing that we always forget in communication is listening. Listening is massive in this space because, again, when you just take that step back and listen, there's so much that can come from that. And yeah, I mean, it plays a vital role, both in terms of the creation, propagating messages, recruiting people, evolving and feeding things back, and yeah, an ability to collaborate, take people on that journey, and then to take a step back, listen, reflect, and potentially change direction a little bit and evolve things going forward.
Okay, I just want all of them at the one time. And I like the description, massive. So that's what it's about, getting the comms in a really structured and right way. And Hayley, I think it's time for you to ask a question.
It is. Before I do, I just want to wrap up though. Got to just commend the value that you've added to that conversation around communication for people listening who are doing well-being, to understand that there are so many different channels, avenues, and stakeholders. And the basics of communication is not just to tell, but to listen and to consult and to allow for participation. So I think a huge help for the listeners to understand what you have just explained in such a succinct way. So thanks, Lee. We are coming to the end of our conversation. It's been incredible. I've got a question, and I think Pete will probably wrap up in a mo, but what are your predictions? What does the future of wellbeing in the UK look like?
Oh, tell you what, you put me on the spot there. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you work in this field, you have to have hope and optimism for the future. I don't think we can do this work, which sometimes is tiring, sometimes feels like an uphill battle, without that hope and optimism that as we get more understanding, as people become more appreciative of just how valuable well-being is, not only to health, but also to performance, to the sustainability of people. And that's what I'm kind of hoping that well-being moves towards. We kind of talk about sustainability in business, and a lot of people think straight away about recycling and planting some trees. But ultimately, I firmly believe that work should be a net positive contributor towards human beings. And to get there, we almost need to look at well-being as the sustainability of people. And as we kind of look, and companies start to really showcase how they're bringing inclusion and well-being together, I absolutely love that, it's starting to turn into much more than just this small thing that we tack onto HR. We're actually becoming something that companies are properly resourcing. They're utilising the ability to really harness some of this data to be able to, again, focus on prevention and really target interventions, so we don't fall into the place of, well, we tried wellbeing, but it doesn't work. Because that's been a barrier and obstacle for us as practitioners, and for those both internally and externally over the years. But for me, the future, again, technology has its place, but it needs to be used mindfully, intentionally, and in a way that doesn't remove other well-being benefits. Like sometimes technology can remove social and environmental well-being benefits through its use. So it's, again, that mindful, intentional use of technology. We know AI is really powerful. We're seeing that in our everyday lives right now. It has and can be harnessed in a positive way for well-being, but it also has a lot of pitfalls and a lot of potential challenges that it might well raise over the next few years. But I suppose for me, the younger generation is very, very much switched on. They're very knowledgeable. That's a positive, but we do need to find a balance where companies really value well-being for what it can bring when it's done properly. I think that's the biggest thing we face. But the case studies that are coming out, the companies that are doing it well, and how companies are now saying we're struggling to keep talent, we need to do something from a wellbeing perspective, it's driving the conversation forward. So yeah, I think in the next 5 years, we'll be a lot clearer on how we work, because this hybrid working is still everywhere. Nothing is really settled. I think the tail end of the pandemic and some of the struggles that people are going through will have got to a point where we've found balance then. But we do need to start to create the structures and systems in society for people to be well, because we're not going to suddenly stop having these crises. There's a reason why permacrisis was like the word of the year last year. It's because if it's not some war or an illness, it's financial challenges, it's political instability, it's cost of living, there's always going to be something. So we need to get ourselves into a well place individually, in the workplace, and socially as well.
Great answer, Lee. Absolutely great answer. And as the oldest person on this podcast, the future's bright, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you guys do when I'm retired and walking along beaches and with my dog or something, because I think, we're not finished. We need to really, this has to become standard practice. 101 in work. Look after your people, look after their well-being. Lee, before I finish, we normally have one key takeaway, okay? I know it's hard, but one key takeaway for our listeners, and then we'll wrap up. And what might that be?
You know what? I'm going to be slightly controversial and say, ask your people. It's the one thing that's really underrepresented, is that your employees, if you get them together and get them to actually, dial down what some of the challenges are, they will give you some of the really kind of important answers. Taking a bit of time to just listen to your people, that's the communication aspect coming in right there. Utilise that. And that can be a benchmark for change. So yeah, tap into the resource that you've already got, your people, get their minds working.
That honestly, Lee, that is absolutely brilliant. We could have spent an eternity with you having conversations, but as we close up, what I'd like to do is to remind people you can like and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety podcast to hear from future guests looking at the needle of health and safety and wellbeing spaces we've done today. Don't forget you can watch us on YouTube, FlourishDX LinkedIn page for short clips, and then you can connect with Hayley, and Lee, because I know you like to connect with people on LinkedIn. We'll all be here for you. But thank you, Lee, for coming, and thank you for your enthusiasm and the fact that you're going to meet me on Monday to roll a chocolate egg down the hill in Avon Park at 11:30. And I will confirm, once this has gone out, that will have happened. I will confirm that you do come.
Sorry, Pete, I just want to confirm to our listeners, Lee, Pete, will you be at the water cooler event later on this month?
Oh, I will be, yes. I'm also at the awards ceremony. I was one of the judges. Very inspiring times, Lee, at the moment. Equally, there's still a concentration on things that are so individually focused, but we'll beat them. We'll get it. We'll drum it out of people. But yeah, I will be there. What about you?
Great. Lee?
Yeah, sadly, I won't be there because I was due to actually chair a track, but I'm not available on that day. I've got other things going on. So disappointed not to meet the community and get out of the little bubble that we sometimes have. But more than ever, I should be at Make a Difference in the autumn.
Okay.
Fantastic.
And
I will be there, but we will continue to connect.
Absolutely. And if not, you can find me and Lee throwing eggs down the side of a park.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow FlourishDX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.